The moment France publicly said it had no desire to boycott the 2026 World Cup, despite escalating geopolitical tension involving the United States and Greenland, it revealed something much larger than a simple sports decision. It exposed how global politics, national interests, public diplomacy, and global sports are increasingly entangled in ways that are impossible to separate. On the surface, this looks like a minor controversy about football, but underneath, it reflects the fragile balance between political symbolism and real-world power calculations, as well as the limits of moral gestures in a world shaped by strategic interests. The controversy began after reports that the United States had outlined a framework for gaining control over parts of Greenland, a move that triggered concern among European leaders and sparked debate about international norms. Some political voices in France suggested that the country should boycott the World Cup in protest, arguing that participating in a major tournament hosted by the United States would indirectly legitimize Washington's actions. However, the French sports minister stated clearly that there was currently no desire to boycott the tournament and emphasized that sports should remain separate from politics. This seemingly cautious statement is actually a revealing case study of how modern states navigate symbolic politics in an interconnected world. At first glance, the idea of a boycott sounds powerful. Historically, sporting boycotts have been used as political tools, from the Cold War-era Olympics to various diplomatic protests in international tournaments. In theory, withdrawing from a globally watched event sends a strong signal, draws media attention, and creates reputational costs for the host nation. But in practice, boycotts are blunt instruments that often hurt the boycotting side as much as or more than the target. France's reluctance to boycott the World Cup demonstrates that even countries that are vocal about international norms are cautious when symbolic action collides with tangible national interests. The World Cup is not just a sporting event. It is one of the most powerful platforms for national branding, economic opportunity, and soft power projection. Participation brings sponsorships, tourism, media exposure, and national pride. For a country like France with a strong football tradition and global fan base, withdrawing would mean surrendering influence, disappointing fans, and potentially weakening its global cultural footprint. The cost of a boycott would be immediate and visible, while the political impact on the United States would be uncertain and likely limited. This highlights a core reality of modern geopolitics. Moral signaling is often constrained by practical interests. Governments regularly express concern over international developments, but when faced with decisions that carry economic, cultural, or strategic costs, they often choose moderation. France's statement that it prefers to keep sports separate from politics is not just a principled stance, it is a strategic one. It allows Paris to maintain diplomatic criticism in other channels while avoiding a dramatic gesture that could isolate it from allies, fans, and international sporting institutions. Another layer of complexity lies in the nature of the controversy itself. The issue of Greenland is not a simple bilateral dispute. It touches on Arctic geopolitics, NATO relationships, energy interests, and great power competition. Greenland's strategic location and resources make it an increasingly valuable territory in global politics. Any move by the United States to expand influence there is viewed through the lens of global competition and alliance politics. For European countries, especially those with close ties to Denmark, the issue is sensitive, but also entangled in broader strategic relationships with Washington. Boycotting a World Cup over such a complex issue could oversimplify a nuanced diplomatic situation and escalate tensions in ways that may not be productive. The French response also reflects the internal political dynamics within the country. Calls for a boycott came from certain political factions, particularly those more skeptical of U.S. foreign policy. These voices see sports as a stage for protest and symbolic resistance. However, the government's measured response shows the difference between political rhetoric and governing responsibility. In democratic societies, opposition voices can propose bold actions, but those in power must weigh consequences. A boycott would not just be a protest, it would be a national decision affecting athletes, fans, businesses, and diplomatic relations. This divergence between activist rhetoric and state pragmatism is a recurring theme in modern politics. Public discourse often pushes for dramatic gestures, while policymakers prefer incremental and calculated responses. The French government's position illustrates how states try to maintain moral credibility without jeopardizing their strategic interests. By saying it will not prejudge future developments, the government keeps its options open while signaling that it currently prioritizes stability. The reaction also reveals something about the evolving role of sports in global politics. For decades, sports were often framed as a neutral arena, a place where nations compete peacefully. But in reality, sports have always been political. Hosting rights, sponsorships, and participation decisions are deeply intertwined with diplomacy and global influence. The difference today is that social media, global news cycles, and political polarization amplify every statement and decision, turning sporting events into battlegrounds for political narratives. In this case, the World Cup becomes a symbol of broader tensions between Europe and the United States. Some critics argue that participating without protest normalizes controversial policies. Others argue that sports should not be weaponized for political disputes. This tension reflects a deeper question. What is the role of cultural and sporting platforms in international politics? Are they neutral spaces that should be protected from political conflict, or are they legitimate tools for political expression? France's choice suggests that major powers increasingly see sports as too valuable to sacrifice for symbolic gestures unless the political stakes are extreme. This is not necessarily cynicism. It is realism. In a world where soft power is a critical asset, withdrawing from global events can mean forfeiting influence. Participating, on the other hand, allows a country to maintain visibility, shape narratives, and engage with global audiences. Another important aspect is the reaction of international sporting organizations. Historically, organizations like FIFA and the International Olympic Committee have tried to maintain neutrality, resisting political pressures and emphasizing global unity. This approach has often been criticized as apolitical or even complicit in controversial contexts. However, from their perspective, political neutrality is essential for maintaining global participation and commercial viability. France's statement aligns with this institutional philosophy, reinforcing the idea that sports organizations and governments share an interest in keeping major events insulated from geopolitical disputes. Yet, the idea that sports can be fully separated from politics is increasingly difficult to sustain. Fans, athletes, and activists use sporting platforms to raise awareness about social and political issues. Governments use major tournaments for national branding and diplomacy. Media coverage frames sporting events in political contexts. In such an environment, saying sports should be separate is less a description of reality and more a strategic aspiration. The Greenland controversy also demonstrates how rapidly international issues can spill into unrelated domains. A geopolitical dispute over territory becomes a topic in sports ministries, football federations, and fan communities. This spillover effect is a hallmark of a hyper-connected world, where every issue becomes global and symbolic. Governments must constantly manage how these symbols are interpreted domestically and internationally. From the U.S. perspective, the possibility of a boycott by a major football nation would be a public relations challenge, but likely not a strategic crisis. The United States co-hosting the World Cup with Canada and Mexico already spreads the event across multiple jurisdictions. A French boycott would generate headlines, but the tournament would go on. This asymmetry of impact explains why states like France are cautious about using boycotts as tools. The symbolic cost to the host may be limited, while the cost to the boycotting country is concrete. There is also the domestic dimension within France. Football is deeply embedded in French national identity, and the national team is a major source of unity and pride. A boycott would be unpopular among fans and athletes, potentially creating political backlash. Governments must consider not just international reactions, but domestic political consequences. In this sense, the decision not to boycott is as much about internal politics as external diplomacy. The episode also reflects a broader trend in international relations: the decline of large-scale collective boycotts. During the Cold War, blocs of countries sometimes coordinated sporting boycotts as part of ideological conflicts. Today, global interdependence makes such coordination more difficult. Economic ties, alliance structures, and global media ecosystems mean that unilateral boycotts are less effective and more costly. France's position illustrates this shift from ideological confrontation to pragmatic engagement. At a deeper level, this situation raises questions about the future of global governance. When major powers pursue controversial policies, what tools do other states have to respond? Diplomatic protests, economic measures, and international institutions all play roles, but symbolic actions like sports boycotts are increasingly seen as limited. France's decision suggests that governments prefer to address disputes through diplomatic and economic channels rather than cultural isolation. This does not mean that sports are apolitical or irrelevant. On the contrary, the attention generated by these debates shows how powerful sports symbolism remains. But symbolism alone is rarely sufficient to alter strategic behavior. Governments understand this, which is why they are selective in their use of symbolic actions. The French statement also reflects the complexity of European unity. While some voices call for strong collective responses to U.S. actions, achieving consensus among European countries is challenging. Different states have different economic ties, security concerns, and political cultures. Coordinated boycotts would require alignment that is difficult to achieve in a diverse political landscape. France's cautious stance may reflect not only national calculation, but also awareness of the difficulty of building a unified European response. Furthermore, the World Cup itself is a global commercial enterprise with powerful stakeholders, including sponsors, broadcasters, and corporations. These actors have significant influence and would strongly oppose major disruptions. Governments must consider the economic ecosystem surrounding global sports events, which extends far beyond national teams and fans. A boycott would disrupt contracts, sponsorships, and investments, creating legal and financial complications. In this context, France's position appears as a pragmatic acknowledgement of how deeply global sports are embedded in economic and political systems. Moral gestures cannot be evaluated in isolation. They exist within networks of interests and consequences. The debate also touches on the evolving concept of sovereignty and global norms. The Greenland issue is framed by critics as a challenge to international law and norms. But international law often coexists with power politics. Countries express support for norms while navigating power realities. The World Cup controversy becomes a microcosm of this broader tension between normative ideals and geopolitical pragmatism. Another dimension is public perception and media framing. Media outlets across the world frame the French decision differently depending on political orientation. Some portrayed it as a sensible separation of sports and politics, while others criticized it as moral weakness. This demonstrates how global events are filtered through ideological lenses, reinforcing polarization. Governments must navigate not only policy decisions, but also narrative battles. For France, maintaining a balanced narrative is crucial. By emphasizing the importance of sports and avoiding a definitive stance on future actions, the government positions itself as responsible and pragmatic while not closing the door to future diplomatic responses. This rhetorical strategy allows flexibility and avoids alienating multiple audiences. Looking ahead, this episode may set a precedent for how countries handle future geopolitical controversies involving major sporting events. It suggests that boycotts will be considered but rarely implemented unless the situation escalates dramatically. Instead, governments will likely rely on diplomatic pressure, economic measures, and public statements while maintaining participation in global cultural events. The World Cup, in this sense, becomes a stage where political tensions are visible but not decisive. Nations may argue, criticize, and posture, but the tournament proceeds, reflecting a world where global interconnectedness often overrides political disputes. This is both a sign of global stability and a reminder of the limits of symbolic politics. Ultimately, France's statement that it has no desire to boycott the World Cup amid the U.S. Greenland controversy is a window into modern international relations. It reveals how governments balance ideals and interests, how sports function as both cultural events and political symbols, and how global power dynamics shape even the most seemingly apolitical arenas. This episode shows that in the 21st century, politics and sports are inseparable in practice, but governments still pretend they are separate in principle. That contradiction is not hypocrisy. It is strategy. It allows states to navigate a world where every action is symbolic, every symbol has economic consequences, and every consequence has political implications. In the end, the French decision is less about football and more about realism. It reflects a world where moral statements coexist with strategic caution, where symbolism is weighed against influence, and where global events are too valuable to sacrifice for gestures that may change little. The World Cup will go on, the debates will continue, and the tension between politics and sports will remain a defining feature of global society.